Can you hear me? Great. Okay. I'm Awadagin Pratt, in case you couldn't tell. I'm going to be playing and talking to you a little bit about the pieces that I'm playing, a little bit about the sort of background of the pieces, history of the pieces, a little interesting anecdotes about the composers, and then probably the last 15 minutes or so take some questions about myself and my background and or about the music and composers. I'd like to start with some works of Bach. I'm going to begin with the Chromatic Fantasy from a piece called the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue. And Bach wrote many, maybe you know, a lot of preludes and fugues. A fugue is a piece with 3 or 4 voices that enter separately, basically saying the same thing over and over, sort of accompanied by different things. And he wrote preludes to these fugues. In this case, the prelude to the fugue is in the form of a fantasy, which sort of has an aspect of improvisation. So in Bach's time and up through until more modern times, composers were also played instruments, and improvisation was a common element of what they were able to do. And so this piece begins, and you can sort of hear there are no 2 things that are really directly related. It sort of starts and stops and starts and stops. And one of the interesting things is that there are actually spots where Bach has encouraged the performer to improvise. And so he would write a block chord like this. Which is really not very interesting, and he would expect that the performer would roll the chords in any way that he or she chose to fill out that sort of improvisation. And that happens pretty much any time when I'm playing broken chords like that. It's sort of improvised. I've sort of planned out a bit what I'm going to do, but not completely. And there's a middle section which he calls recitativo, which would sort of come from an operatic form where you'll hear one voice singing in the right hand and punctuated by chords in the left hand. And the chromatic element, chromatic meaning consecutive half steps, is really present at the very end of the piece, and maybe you'll hear it descending right at the very end of the piece. So this is the Chromatic Fantasy from the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue of Bach. And what follows after that is sort of very rambling in a way, and what follows after that is a very organized, architecturally organized work called the Fugue. I'm going to not do the Fugue and go to another work of Bach, but which has a different kind of organization, but it's a different organization from the Fugue, but a similar sort of rigid kind. It's called a Chaconne, and a Chaconne is a kind of dance with a strong beat too. So it's in 3 beats. So what would ordinarily be sort of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, with the 1 is always a strong beat. In a Chaconne, it becomes 2. So it's 1 is sort of dead, and then it's 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And the other aspect of the Chaconne is the bass line, which in this case is this. 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. Those are the first 4 measures. The next 4 measures repeats the same bass line. What happens in this piece is it's a set of variations. So the constant throughout the whole piece is this bass line. Sometimes it's more implied than present. There'll be certain passages that I'll play where you'll hear it very clearly, and certain passages where you'll hear it less clearly. This piece was originally the last movement of a work for solo violin. Bach was a tremendously prolific composer. Like I said, he was an organist, but he wrote works for solo violin, for violin with orchestra, violin with piano, works for solo cello and cello with piano, cantatas for voice, and hundreds of, literally hundreds of works. A man named Ferruccio Busoni, who was an Italian who lived into this century, end of last century, felt that a lot of Bach's works weren't known well enough to the public, and so some of these pieces he transcribed for the piano. So he took this piece, which was supposed to be on the violin, and put it on the piano. And it's completely different sounding in a way, but he attempted to achieve the same level of grandeur that it has on the violin. So it's I sort of think of it more as a transcription that he made for the piano, but he sort of had the organ in mind. I'm going to play the first third of this piece, and it comes very cleanly to a nice demarcation before it goes into D major. So this is the part of the Chaconne in D minor of Bach. One thing you might notice is that you probably, I don't know if anyone can see the pedals from here. The first piece I played without pedals, sort of trying to play a little drier, like Bach wrote it for the harpsichord. And this piece, although it's by Bach, but it was written by a man who had a closer piano to this than what Bach had, and he employed the pedals. So you'll hear a completely different sound even within the 2 works. Thank you. I'm going to play next a work of Beethoven, or part of a work of Beethoven's, from a piano concerto. And a piano concerto is a work written for piano with orchestra, and you'll see there's no orchestra here. But it's interesting about Beethoven, and like I said, other composers that used to perform. This concerto he wrote for himself. All his first 4 piano concertos, he gave the premieres of the performances, and so as such, they sort of served to demonstrate his abilities at the piano, and he was quite a noted virtuoso. And so much of these opening few concertos that he wrote, and this also has to do with his development of concerto form, but could be played to a large extent without the orchestra, whereas the 4th and 5th concertos, there's so much in the piano part that's sort of accompanimental to the orchestra that it doesn't work. But why I like this movement and why I'm going to play it is because there's a lot of, we tend not to think of humor in music as much as there is a lot of it. And there are a lot of little funny things that Beethoven does in this, sort of where you expect the rhythm to go bum 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 bum. He'll do bop 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 bop, and sort of, it'll sort of jab at you a little bit, and it's sort of interesting. It's sort of very subtle, and expecting sort of consonant notes like this, and then he'll stick in a G sharp for no reason, and it's sort of interesting. And so this will be some of the third movement of Beethoven's first piano concerto. Thanks. Thank you. That movement's always very fun to play because the movement right before it is a very it's a very beautiful slow movement. It's very somber. And it's very long, and it's, it's beautiful. You enjoy it, but I mean, as soon as that movement starts, it surprises everybody. And the conductor and I almost invariably, because I played this part and it was kind of funny, but with the orchestra, when it starts to go like this, and the orchestra has just played this same melody, and right before, the conductor and I are always sort of looking at each other like, okay, we're going to get him here. It's very fun. Now, where Beethoven, in his life, we being music-type people, we've divided his life into three periods, early, middle, and late. This concerto comes from Opus 15, work number 15, which is in his early period. In his later period, which is well after he had already become deaf, his works have a greatly different tone. This previous piece had there's a lot of rhythmic activity, sort of, you really feel where the beats are in a very active way. A lot of what happened in a lot of the later music was sort of more dealing with lyrical and sort of horizontal elements, melody and harmony, as well as the expression and the expressivity of the piece becomes sometimes a little more elusive. It's not so easy to tell what Beethoven was after. A lot of people talk about a transcendental quality or a spiritual quality, that he was looking to express things that are not, concrete and of the earth. I'm going to play from the last movement of one of the late sonatas. He wrote he probably wrote 5 piano sonatas in that period of his life. And this is the Opus 109. And it's from the last movement, which is a set of variations. Now, the set of variations that I played of Bach before were played without any interruption between the variations. Here, you'll hear the theme very clearly, then there'll be a stop, and then the first variation and a stop, second variation, a stop. I think 3 and 4 pretty much go into one another. But it's a completely different variation set, and this one is based on the melody. It's more melodically based than on the bass line as in the Bach. So this is from the Sonata Opus 109. I'm going to shift gears quite a bit with the next piece, which is a transcription of a song. It's a song written by Robert Schumann, who lived from about 1810 to 1856, I believe. And he wrote it as a wedding present to his wife. And it's a very beautiful song. The first thing that you'll hear is just the simple melody of it. There was a man named Franz Liszt who was really the first pianist to become a touring virtuoso. Whereas Haydn and Beethoven and Mozart would travel around performing their own works, Liszt was one of the first to play actively the works of other composers and to travel and play his own works and take Beethoven's symphonies and arrange them for two pianos and take a whole entire Wagner opera and paraphrase it so that he could play all the catchy tunes in 20 minutes instead of 4 days. So he was a well-known, famous virtuoso. And so, similar to what he did with the operas and symphonies, he took this song, which was for voice and piano, and transcribed it for the piano. And what he did with many of the things that he paraphrased were also to put things in it which showed his own facility at the piano. So the first couple of times the melody comes very simply. The last two times that you hear it, there are a lot of flourishes at the piano and sort of grand bravura type things. The name of the song is Widmung, roughly translated dedication, Schumann Liszt. I'll tell you a little bit about myself now, then maybe take some questions. I was born in Pittsburgh. I only lived there my first 3 years, and then moved to central Illinois, a town called Normal, which is where I grew up and turned out completely normal. I went to university first at University of Illinois, where I studied. I'd started piano when I was 6 and violin when I was 9, and at the time I was entering college, I hadn't decided that I liked one more than the other, and so I wanted to double major. And the university said, well, no, you can't. And so we'd received the information for the violin application materials first, so that's what I ended up as a violin major. And during the course of the time there, initially I was studying piano with a teaching assistant, and about every third or fourth lesson she'd say, well, Awadagin, if you want to be a piano major, you could probably get into the piano department. I said, well, they've told me that I can't. Eventually I had a very good friend who was a Brazilian guy, and his mother eventually came to teach at the school. And I arranged an audition with her, and she went to the piano department and said, you've got to hear this guy. And so I eventually got in, although I was never officially there a double major because I couldn't be. Eventually I decided I want to go to a music conservatory, and so I ended up going to Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore. And there I studied piano, violin, and conducting. And after, I guess about 3 years ago now, almost 4 years ago, I decided I wasn't too much interested in the violin anymore, so it's sort of been retired. And most of my time now is taken up playing the piano because of the competition that I won, but conducting is still very important to me, and so I've done a few things the past year. I have a few things coming up next season, and hopefully a few more the season after that. I'll take some questions now. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Why did I choose the violin over the viola? Well, at the point when I decided to when I decided I wanted to play an instrument, for some reason I didn't even know the viola existed, so I went for the violin. I knew of the cello, and I sort of liked that, but I didn't. But eventually, actually, when I was at Peabody, I took viola lessons a little bit and played in an orchestra, but I like the viola now, but I didn't know of it then.
My name is Christine Mason, and I attend Hylton High School, and I was wondering, in the hours before competition, how do you prepare mentally and physically?
That's in the case of the Naumburg competition was the only one. Sorry, the only one that I did that lasted for several days. There were several rounds of it, and the preparation was different because, some competitions you'll go there and you're able to warm up. There'll be you'll have a warm-up piano, but there are actually quite a lot of competitions where there's not, and so I would sort of get accustomed to, for instance, Naumburg's in New York. I was going up from Baltimore. I just ride the train and just sort of think about what I was about to do. But I would ride the train for about 2 hours and 45 minutes and get there and just have to play cold. So there you sort of just really trying to concentrate. And usually you can begin with the piece of your choice. And so then you want to make sure it's something that you can literally play in your sleep or without warming up. And so that's how that goes. But the finals, of course, then they had a warm-up piano. You could warm up. And I mean, the preparation is what works for me wouldn't necessarily work for anyone else. But it's most of it, as long as the fingers are warm, literally warm and not cold, then most of it is mental and concentrating and thinking about the first few notes that you're going to play.
Hi, my name is Rossi Borneo, and I attend Potomac High School. I'd like to know what kind of music training you had in elementary, middle, and high school.
Well, when I began studying the piano, the first place that I studied was a place where they had, electronic consoles, maybe 8 to 10 of them in a room, and the teacher's sitting back in the back, and you got headphones on, and they're like, play middle C. And I did that for a while, and then actually the same teacher started teaching me privately. Most of the time when I was growing up, more of my energies were, I was very much a tennis player, and so music was sort of getting like an hour a day per instrument or half an hour a day. Later, my last 2 years in high school, I had a very good teacher who was teaching at the local university, who was really excellent, and I started to work in a different way.
Hi, my name is Natalie Wang, and I'm from Potomac High School. And I was wondering if you had any special techniques that you could tell me about memorizing a piece of music.
Boy, I don't have any special techniques, but I can tell you again, memory works different ways for different people. But you have some people have the photographic memory, so they can look at the score and literally see the notes on the page as they're playing. Most of us aren't so lucky, so there are two different kinds of memory which happen. One is the physical memory. Your hands and fingers and arms memorize the patterns of the passages that you're playing through repetition. I often find that the passages I've played, the most difficult passages I've worked on the most, and so they come to my hands much more quickly. And then there's the memory of the ear, because the ear hears, again through repetition and studying the score, your ear is usually the thing, if you ever have a memory slip, which pulls you out, is your ear sort of hears where you're supposed to be and what's supposed to be going on. And then there's also, as well, the intellectual sort of textual memory. At the development, it goes into E major, then F major, then G flat minor, and then at the recap it doesn't do this and it does that. That kind of thing is helpful as well. But those are sort of the variables you play with in memory. So let's see.
Hi, my name is Shoshana Linder, and I'm homeschooled. And I was wondering what makes you decide which pieces you will perform in concert?
For a recital, I have a complete choice. I'll say, whatever pieces are interesting to me at the time or have been for the last 6 months, things I've been working on and thinking about, and sort of try and put together a program that makes sense musically and emotionally, sort of through the 75 or 80 minutes. Concerto-wise, with an orchestra, it's I usually submit a list. My manager will submit a list to the presenter, and then the presenters would usually choose based on what they played this season or last season and stuff like that. I think, are there any other questions? Sure. Hi. If I had anything that I had written that was not written when I was about 9, I would. Sorry. But what I'll do, on the other hand, is end the way I began with some Bach. And I want to thank you all for being here, and I've enjoyed playing for you. And this will be, oddly enough, another concerto. This is the Bach A Major Concerto, which I think may have originally been a flute concerto. Bach transcribed all of his works, sort of recycled. He'd write a cantata, then 2 years later it would show up as an organ prelude, and 3 years later it'd show up as the slow movement of a violin concerto, and then 4 years later you'd see that Handel had stolen it for something else. So this is from the A Major Concerto of Bach.